Welcome to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't, a podcast dedicated to helping you create the relationship you truly want.
Improving persuasion and negotiation skills for healthy relationships. In this episode, we dive deep into essential relationship advice by exploring how improving your persuasion and negotiation skills can lead to healthier relationships. Many people misunderstand these skills as manipulative tactics, but in reality, they are grounded in respect, empathy, and clear communication. Whether you're navigating tough relationship questions or seeking ways to strengthen trust, mastering these abilities allows you to express your needs while honoring your partner's perspective. Discover how genuine persuasion, when practiced authentically, can support lasting bonds and mutual understanding in all your relationships. Too often, we focused on crafting our reply instead of truly hearing what the other person is saying. Y'all do that. I know I've done it. Really listening involves suspending judgment, asking clarifying questions, and reflecting back what you've heard to ensure understanding. When people feel heard and validated, they become more open to real dialogue and compromise. Listening skills can uncover the real issues beneath surface disagreements and build emotional safety, the very foundation of every healthy negotiation. Equally important is emotional regulation. Negotiations can easily become emotionally charged, especially when personal values or expectations are at stake. Defensiveness and reactivity derail productive dialogue. The ability to stay calm, express emotions without blame, and avoid escalating tension allows both sides to stay focused on solutions instead of blame. The easy comfort of blame that we all love. Empathy turns persuasion into partnership. When you demonstrate that you genuinely understand another person's perspective, you shift from opposites to allies, looking for a common path forward. Empathy doesn't mean agreeing with everything the other person says. It means being willing to see from their vantage point and honor their feelings as legit. This emotional bridge invites reciprocity. When someone feels understood, they're far more likely to understand you in return. In season 1 of one of the new Star Treks, the captain is very frustrated in negotiating with a new alien race. And then he realizes that radical empathy was the only way to push forward because the alien race wanted to be understood before they made new agreements. Today's guest, who will help us improve our skills at collaboration instead of competition, is John Richardson. He will reveal how FBI hostage negotiation tactics and Harvard research transform the most challenging relationship dynamics. He taught at Harvard Law and now is at MIT. He taught alongside Getting to Yes author Roger Fisher and FBI negotiator Chris Voss for 30-plus years. He will share the same principles that get armed criminals to peacefully release hostages that can be used in getting your teenager to do homework. Your partner to hear what you're actually saying, or your in-laws to respect your boundaries. He has been one of 2 authors who have written the new book published March 12th, Never Settle, Persuasion and Negotiation Skills to Get What You Want. So glad to have you here today. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Rhoda. I'm delighted to be here.
In your first chapter, you say this about negotiating, and I'm quoting, even a lifelong criminal feels the obligation to repay generosity. So could we begin by you talking about how this can work for my audience in their daily life? Because reciprocity is hardwired in all of us. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah. The way it comes up in hostage negotiation is that the police will often do tiny little favors for someone holding hostages and often get tremendous results in return. Dominic Messino was with the NYPD as a hostage negotiator, and he used to start every lecture he would give training new hostage negotiators. He would say, "What is the value of a human life?" And people would say, "Oh, it's priceless, it's infinite." And he'd say, 3 cigarettes usually does it. And the reason is because if they have there are different kinds of hostage or crisis negotiation situations. And one is what they call an unplanned barricade. Like you decide to rob a bank. You're not planning on holding hostages. You just wanted to rob a bank. But the cops show up because someone pulled the alarm. And now you're stuck in there, so you point your gun at, a teller and a customer. And that used to be the strategy, 40 years ago, was you've got 10 minutes and then, we're coming in. And that was about 50-50 is someone going to get shot. And now it's better than 95% peaceful resolution. And what they do is, well, first of all, they just talk. And they're happy to listen to you very empathetically. They'll say, well, they start by saying, "Are you okay? Do you need a doctor?" So the first thing they do is express concern for the perpetrator. But then the second thing, then they start saying, does anybody else in there need a doctor? So then they start trying to get you concerned about these other people that you were with. But what they're really waiting for is for you to get hungry or thirsty and say, I want you to give me some food. Now, there's a lot of things they won't give you. They're not going to give you a getaway car. They're not going to give you weapons or drugs. But a sandwich or a pack of cigarettes or a drink of water, or you want to call your mother, we're happy to do all that kind of stuff. And then when you're biting into that sandwich, the hostage negotiator will get on, back on the phone with you and say, "Hey, the lieutenant here is kind of mad at me because, I gave you that sandwich and he thought I was being soft on you, but I think you're a good guy. Could you help me out and just let somebody go?" And it almost always works because people have this instinct that when someone's nice to you, you have to be nice back. When, Bob Cialdini was the psychologist who first started investigating this, and he had a trick. He used to, every year, he, would send out 100 Christmas cards randomly to people out of the phone book and track how many he got back next year from the same people. And it was usually like 80. And they didn't know who he was, but they just thought, well, he sent us one, we're sending one back. Maybe he was at Louise's wedding. I don't know. But that same thing, I think, helps a lot in personal relationships, or at least that's been my experience. Because this is one of the assignments we would give our students. Let's say you have a roommate who's driving you crazy because he never does the dishes. The first exercise we suggest our students is just do those dishes that are in the sink that are bothering you in front of your roommate. It doesn't help if they're not there. They won't really pay any attention to where the dishes went. But if you're doing their dishes in front of them, they start to feel uncomfortable. And, they'll say, "Oh, well, I'll get to those later." And you say, I just like a clean kitchen, so I'll just take care of it now. If you do that 2 or 3 times, they're going to start doing it too. Or let's say you want your sister to call you once a week to catch up. Just start calling her. And then after a couple weeks, stop and see if she calls you back. And it usually works that they'll imitate the behavior that, especially if it's benefiting them. I mean, if your sister hates you and never wants to talk to you, then it won't have the same impact. But if if it's just other things in her day get in the way of her remembering to, this is going to remind her. So the easiest way to change somebody's behavior is just start acting the way you want them to act, and then they'll start doing it too. But if there's something more particular you want, and this I learned from my wife, you can use the same method, but naming the behavior that you want to see. When we first got married, my wife would, hint at it. She'd say, "Hey, boy, the garbage is getting really full." And I'd say, "Sure is. Does that mean you're going to take it out?" Because we're both sitting on the couch. And so my decision is, well, do I keep sitting on the couch or should I get up while she keeps sitting on the couch? Hey, you got two arms and two legs too. But so what she started doing was to go into the kitchen. Well, she'd wait for me to be in the kitchen. She'd go in the kitchen and start unloading the dishwasher. And I don't like unloading the dishwasher. And while she's unloading the dishwasher, she'll say, "Hey, could you take out the garbage while I'm doing this?" And while I'm doing this is sort of a silver bullet, because I can't say, "Well, you could get up and take the garbage out," now, and she's doing something that benefits me. So now I really have no choice, and I'll automatically, take out the garbage. But what you have to watch for if you're on the receiving end of this, now it's not a bad thing for me to be on the receiving end of this because I'd rather take out the garbage than unload the dishwasher. So we're both coming out ahead. But what another aspect of this behavioral psychologists call accounting insensitivity. You get 3 cigarettes and you give up a human life. People automatically feel this instinct that I have to pay them back, but they're really terrible at keeping track of who owes who how much. And so, yes, I'll let a hostage go for a sandwich. My wife, one time she said to me, "Hey, well, I'm unloading the dishwasher. Could you go get new snow tires on my car?" And I'm in the tire shop, having a drink of coffee before I say, "Wait a minute, come on." But because it's so automatic. So you have to, be on the lookout to make sure that it is a fair transaction that's benefiting both. But you can get that transaction started, almost unconsciously just by doing something good for them while that makes it impossible for you to do the other thing that you'd like them to do. I mean, your listeners can try that on their spouse or kids or whatever. Works great on kids.
It's so valuable because it's such a positive way instead, and everybody is always fighting about who does more chores and which chore and that. And it undercuts all of that tanglement. And that little bit of shame almost gets triggered that says, yeah,
Absolutely.
I need to pitch in too.
Yeah. Yeah. And the usual thing is, to just, to ask them and then nag them and say, it's so terrible that you never do this. And even if you are the partner who does more, you can leverage that. Just anytime you're doing something is the perfect time to ask them to do a favor for you.
Yeah, I love that. I've just listened to so many people talk about chore fighting, and I never offered that advice. I have to be honest with you. That is after 40 years of working with people, never have I thought about it like that. And that's wonderful. It's really, really helpful. I love that your book has lots of different exercises that people can use to expand their learning. One of them is the best, fine, worst outcome exercise, which is a way to eliminate anxiety before difficult relationship conversations. So could you tell us about mapping realistic scenarios and realizing your worst case is survival to help tamp down anxiety, which we can all use help with?
Sure. And I think that's the important starting point is people are scared about going into negotiations. It's up there with public speaking as, something people are horrified by. And it makes sense because, back in our evolutionary history, if you got kicked out of the caveman tribe, you were done. Like, you need other people to survive. Now, if you ask your boss for a raise and they say no, you're not actually going to die. But there's a part of, your limbic system that worries that you will. And one of the things that helps with that is by going through what's going to happen if they say no. Like you don't have to prepare for what if they say yes, that's fantastic. But what if they say no? One thing you do is paint the scenario in your head and say, okay, what will I do then? if I don't get a raise, well, maybe I won't be able to afford that next vacation, but I'll, still have a house and food and, I'll be sleeping in a warm bed. And some negotiations instructors, Jim Camp comes to mind, likes to instruct his students to think about Lewis and Clark and how they were starving and disease-ridden exploring the American West. If your sales meeting goes terribly, that's not, the same kind of thing, but you're acting like it does. So, actually size up what's at risk for you here and keep that in mind. The other thing that I think is tremendously helpful with pre-negotiation anxiety is to prepare what are you going to do if they say no. Okay, I'm going to ask my boss for a raise, and she says no. What am I going to do then? Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is get on the internet and start looking for other job opportunities. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to use them, but that's something I can do to improve my situation. And I know, I have a plan for what I'm doing if it goes badly. And so, if things don't go your way, then you start implementing your backup plan.
Yeah, that's right. And it's such a normal, ordinary thing to worry and then bail because you're too worried about what's going to happen. So I really appreciate that. So many people in my audience are massively conflict avoiders. How does someone begin to think about negotiating when they hate conflict? Do you have some specific techniques to offer or advice that can help these folks out?
I mean, the first one, the simplest, is just exposure therapy. The more you get into conflicts, then the less scary they are. So I'd start thinking about what are some low risk areas that I could have a conflict with, either with somebody that I don't care about at all, or with somebody that our relationship is strong enough that it can survive a conflict, and start getting into conflicts in those situations. One bit of homework we often give our students is, this weekend, before the next class, we want you to get rejected 5 times. So, go to a restaurant, ask for something that's not on the menu. Or, go into a store and ask for a discount on something that isn't marked down. And what's the worst that can happen? They can say no to you. And then you start feeling, there's a moment of discomfort, but you realize that it was not the end of the world. And I can walk out of the store and I'm still fine. In fact, I could walk back in the store tomorrow. They probably won't even remember you. What typically happens is our fear of rejection is so overblown that we end up having a lot of students who say, look, I tried for hours to get rejected 5 times and they kept saying yes. And I couldn't get the assignment finished. And we're like, okay, that's fine. As long as you face that terror of asking them and getting rejected and risking getting rejected, that's fine. But the odd thing is, people are usually much more compliant with your desires than we fear that they're going to be. The other thing you can do, I think, to tamp down the anxiety is just to be prepared for a negotiation. Roger Fisher, who you mentioned, the Getting Yes guy, he used to love to say, the easiest way to be more assertive is if you have something to assert. So, and that can be figuring out your walkaway alternative that we already talked about, figuring out what are standards for what's fair and right. If you're going to buy a car, you should 100% look up the Kelley Blue Book and look up what similar cars are on Facebook Marketplace for. There's a lot of sources. And then you know what you're going to say. Hey, why should the price be any higher than this? And put the onus on them to explain why that's not fair and right. That, I think, is a tremendously valuable thing, because when you have some outside standard, it's not a fight between you and the other person. For example, when my wife and I, the first time we bought a house, and one of the things my wife loved about it is there was a big jacuzzi tub in the, it's a little condo in Cambridge, but nowadays they put a giant jacuzzi tub in even a little place. And then we had the building inspection, and the inspector said, look, it's a 60-gallon tub, and there's a 25-gallon hot water heater in the basement. That's not going to fill up that tub. And, so I called up the seller and said, hey, you're going to have to knock the price of a new boiler off of our agreement. And he said, I've been flipping houses, fixing them up and selling them again for 30 years. That boiler is fine for that tub. You've never even bought a house before, and you're telling me that you know what the proper, boiler is? Like, get out of here, kid. And, the guy was 30 years older than me and much more experienced in this area. So what am I going to say? And I'm not going to win, can we say the word I'm thinking on the podcast? I'm not going to win a peeing contest with this guy. So I say, well, does the tub manufacturer have a recommendation for the size of hot water heater?
Oh.
And he says, okay, I'll have a new one in this weekend. Because it's not me versus him. It's me, it's him versus the company that made the thing. And he can tell me I'm a little twerp who doesn't know anything. But how's he going to say that to them? It reminded me of a situation when I was, 12 or 13, but I was getting pushed around by some kid on the playground. And, typical, middle school boys bullying. And I say, like, no, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I'm ready to fight you. And, his eyes went wide and he turned pale and turned around and left. And I was like, and I turned around to tell my brother who I'd come to the park with, and he's standing right behind me holding his hockey stick. He's got his mean look on. And I was like, he wasn't afraid of me. He's afraid of Jimmy. But having, Kelly's Blue Book or the manufacturer's recommendation is like your brother standing behind you with a hockey stick. It's backup. And so I would always recommend you're going to feel a lot more safe and comfortable if you've done some research on what the market standards are. And then, the other thing I'd say, you really want to start a negotiation by asking questions and learning more about the way that they think, even if it's someone you know very well for quite a while. And that, going in and saying, I'm going to start not by pounding my fist and making a demand, but by asking them to explain what they care about more. That's not so scary.
We're always talking about curiosity instead of defensiveness, and curiosity is such an important tool, and it makes everything different because you genuinely are interested, and that interest and it changes you. That kind of information really helps you to see something in a different way, and I think it's so sad that we're so polarized because in our country. Because there's really a lot more in the messy middle where we can meet people. It doesn't have to be 1 in 10. It can be 4, 5, 6, and 7, and we just don't think enough like that. And that's a lot of what therapists do. That's what we do, is help people get in that messy middle and try to see each other in a different way. And that's why I like couples so much, because that's really the fun part, is helping people look at and think about something in a fresh way. And curiosity does that. And so I love that you said that.
Could I just, one real world example, I think, that proves the point you've just been making perfectly. When I was working as a researcher at the Harvard Negotiation Project, the cool thing was all kinds of people would call us up and ask for help. And we learned so much stuff from what they were doing. But one of the groups that called us was the New England Organ Bank. And they had the Society of Organ Requesters, which are the people, if you don't have an organ donor card and you're not going to make it, and you're at the emergency room in Boston, they come to your next of kin and say, would it be all right if, would you be interested in organ donation? And every time they get someone to say yes, they save 6 or 7 lives. So it's huge. And they said, we're only getting, maybe 30%. How can we raise that? And I didn't work on this, but 2 colleagues of mine wisely said, we don't know, but we're curious about that. We'll see if we can figure out. And so they noticed that some of the requesters were getting it 80% of the time and some were getting it 10% of the time. All right, let's figure out what the difference is. And they invite them in and videotape them doing a mock request. And they, I think, had 30 things they were coding for to see if, they could find a difference on the videotapes, and they only found one. And it was number of questions asked. And it was so strong in effect that if you were question dominant, that you start with questions and you ask more questions than you say things, you're getting it about 75% of the time. And if you were all statements, which was the most common thing, you're getting it about 25% of the time. Even when they're incredibly empathetic, kind, you as a parent know the terrible pain of losing a child. Well, other parents are going to lose their child, and you're the only one who can help them. And many people say that knowing that part of their child is still alive, it really helps them with the grief. That doesn't work at all. And what works is,
Oh, that's so interesting.
what works is, well, have you thought about organ donation? Are there reasons you want to do it, reasons you don't want to do it? And the two effects are you learn what the problem is that you can fix. Oh, you think you can't have a Catholic funeral if you do organ donation? The Pope loves organ donation. Father O'Malley is our chaplain. He'll come down and talk you through it. Or you might find out, okay, you're Lubavitcher, very Orthodox Jewish. Yeah, your Rebbe would say no. So, can I get you coffee and quit bothering you? But the other thing is how they feel treated by being asked questions instead of told what to do. I mean, this is the worst day of your life, and someone wants to listen to you versus someone wants to tell you what to do. That's a very different experience. And eventually they had, an extensive training about asking questions. But even before they did that, they changed the instructions to the requester from get them to say yes to find out if they would be happier saying yes or no, and get either a good yes or a good no. And just when they did that, their success rate went up 10% before anything else. And I think that's the power of curiosity.
Yes, and the beauty of that story is it can really help stick in people's minds, in my audience, that if they take one thing from today, they'll remember the organ donor story, and it really does enhance curiosity is a whole different deal than making statements. That was great. That's really terrific. So this kind of dovetails in with this conversation. Many of us, conversations about money or other problems derail into defensiveness and blame. Would you tell us about the emotional table setting method that has people addressing feelings on both sides? You talked about it. Is there anything else you want to add to that? I love the expression emotional table setting, so I didn't want to let go of the term in the question.
Yeah, that's Atia's, my co-author, introduced me to that. So props to her for that. One of the things to do is to think about knowing that, strong emotions, and I'd say especially fear and anger, because those put cortisol and, adrenaline, which I guess is now broken down to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those things redirect blood out of your brain and into your skeletal muscles. And so you actually become measurably less smart when you're angry or anxious. And one of the things to do is to think about in advance, is this conversation, what feelings is it going to bring up for me and for the other person? And one thing you could do is, have your feelings about those things in advance. Is it going to make me angry if my wife says this to me? Okay, I can imagine her saying that and feel angry now, and now it's going to be less when it comes along. But another thing we learned from these hostage negotiators is they do something called emotion labels, where if you just say to the other person, wow, it sounds like, you're really upset about this, very frequently that radically changes their emotional temperature. And that makes sense if you think about it. Part of what your emotions do is prepare you for the action, that your unconscious mind thinks is coming. If you're angry and upset, you're thinking, the limbic part of your brain is saying, well, we're either going to have to, hit this guy in the head with a rock, or we're going to have to run away. So either case, we don't really need to do a lot of thinking right now. We want our muscles fully charged. And, one way to deal with that is, if you had a Stairmaster in your office and you could say, hey, do 5 minutes on the Stairmaster, they would run those feelings off. That's what wild animals do with that, which is why they don't get, all the diseases of, cortisol bathing that we get. But the other thing is your emotions are a signaling device. The reason you get angry when you're unfairly treated is so you can act angry and they'll notice that, in a sense, your ability to get angry is a kind of armor that makes other people worry that if I treat this person badly, it might turn out badly for me as well. And so to the extent that it's a signal, if you say, hey, I received the signal that you're upset about this, the emotion's job is done and it's easier to let go of. And it seems to work very, very quickly. Chris and his people in the Black Swan group, I was very lucky to be able to go with them to help them teach hostage negotiation to friendly governments in the Persian Gulf area. And I learned more the first week of that than I think I've ever learned in my life in a similarly short time. And, and I knew all the psychology research, so they could say, this is what we found effective. Like, MIT Boyd, is that true? And I'd be like, oh, yes, the research completely agrees with you. And they'd say, like, okay, fine, that's great. But wait, now I'm forgetting where I started with this story. We were talking about, emotion labels. They played me a tape, because they record all the negotiations they do, of this guy. He was a Marine sergeant in the Iraq War in Basra. And one day he disappeared. And nobody knew where he went until 2 weeks later, he's at his ex-wife's house in Hawaii with a gun. And, they're very alarmed, and they send hostage negotiators. And they played me the tape. He was like ranting and raving, and he says, I found out she was cheating on me. In fact, I think she cheated on me at our wedding reception. And that's why I have to kill her. And the hostage negotiator says to him very calmly, wow, it sounds like you were a good and loyal husband, and she didn't return that behavior. And that's not okay. And you don't want to live that way anymore. And that's why you're so mad about this. And he says, yeah, and never threatened her again. And the thing is, like a lot of people who do things, hurt other people in an emotional rage or hurt themselves, are trying to express something that they don't have the words for. And if you can give them the words, often that's enough to satisfy that urge that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. One simple suggestion that you make is saying someone's name repeatedly, which creates more trust. I've certainly noticed in myself a warmth when someone pays attention to doing that, because so many people say Rhonda. Could you talk about that?
Yeah.
It's such a little thing.
Yeah, but it personalizes you. It takes you from... Well, knowing your name takes you from being a random, scary thing into more of an individual. Or they always try in hostage negotiations, what are the names of the people in there? And they never refer to them as the hostages. It's always, okay, so Margaret and Bob, like, let's talk about what's going to happen with them. But it works the other way, too. If you're showing that they're a person to you, not a thing. By knowing their name and saying it. But it does something else, too, in terms of their... So we all have a filtering system in our brain of what to pay attention to and what not to. And your own name seems to be all the way down at the, because that's probably the first word you learn, and the first, way that language becomes part of your social interaction with your parents. So much so that they find that people who are in a coma or in a persistent vegetative state, their brain will still react to hearing their name, even if their brain isn't doing anything else. So that's like all the way down in terms of gathering their attention. And getting someone's attention to listen to what you want to say to them is, absolutely crucial negotiation skill. And that's a big part of it. So that is something we recommend to our students, is start learning the names of everybody that you see every day. The checkout clerk at the supermarket, the barista who makes your coffee, the people who sit next to you in class. And I think that that's it's so low risk and so easy to do, but it has such big benefits. That's a great entry level technique. I think one of the things we're trying to do with this book is to, our kids today, because Gen Z, they're on all their devices all the time, and they're getting less and less social interaction with other people. But learning the names of people around you is, the breakdown into starting relationships with those people. And so, that's my hope, is that parents will get their kids to start doing this more and more.
Yes, I was working. Our grandson was really shy, and he was in boys' club for a week at Chautauqua. And I would say, "So, who are the people? I know Judah's your best friend at home, but who's your friend in boys' club? Who's interesting in boys' club?" And it's such a little thing, but it is that practice, and that's really something we've been talking about today. Trying to practice some of these things, and then it really changes things in a positive way. It's really cool.
Yeah. And I kind of did a thing. We were talking about reciprocity, and while I'm, unloading the dishwasher, so I was telling my daughter, who's very shy, hey, why don't you, learn more of the names of the girls you sit next to in class? She's at Scripps, a women's college out in California. And she said, well, you're the one who's socially isolated by your devices. You're always arguing about politics all day on Twitter with people. She says, so I say, okay, tell you what, you learn 5 names of your classmates and I will delete my Twitter account. And then when you give your kid like the chance to manipulate and control you for what they think is your benefit, they're much more willing to give, the reverse.
One of the things I would always say to parents parents who are frustrated with their teenagers is, what do you think's the one thing that they're really interested in having? And people would say, well, I don't know. And I'd say power. They want power. And so let them keep the room the way they want to keep it. Let them cut their hair the way they want to cut it, that give them room and it'll go better. One of the things that I think people really struggle with are family expectations. So how can we say no to family without guilt or constantly explaining?
Yeah. So one of the important things in negotiation is to think about the other party's desires, their motivations, what we call interests in the negotiation lingo. And when someone's asking you for something, they have an interest that they want you to fill, but they have other interests as well. And thinking more broadly about their interests, I think very often things that you are afraid about saying no on are actually things that benefit them in the long term, even if they don't make them happy today. And I'm especially thinking here about breaking up with somebody that isn't right for you, but it's very hard to do, and they're going to be so upset. But really, at the end of the day, if it's not going to work with you, they need to know that as soon as possible so they can, start looking for other relationships that'll make them happy. And if you think about other people's long-term interests and desires, a lot of times it's easier to be kind to them in the long term than by agreeing with what they want in the short term. Now, other times, look, my sister-in-law, we were just over there moving, furniture out of her garage for her because, my son has a truck. So, okay, fine. It's easier to say no to big things if you've made a habit of defending your boundaries on little things. And so I'd always be looking for little low-cost things that you can disagree on. And, again, it's exposure therapy. But it also gives you practice in how to do it nicely. And I would even encourage people to practice saying no without any kindness or, explanation. Someone asks you to go to the movie, nope. And the interesting thing is, when you do it very flatly like that, you get a lot less back talk, because it seems, especially if you do it with a descending tone of voice. Usually, often to ingratiate ourselves, we do up talk and end our sentence almost like a question. And that makes us less assertive. And then it feels more okay to do. But if you say, no, I'm not going to do that, They very rarely ask again, but it's also then when you want to do it for real and you do it kindly and say, I'm really sorry. I would love to be able to help you out, but it's not going to be possible for me to do that this weekend. That feels so much lighter and easier than doing it in the harsh way that then, you probably get more ability to do that. It's like the way baseball players, they swing a very heavy bat before they get up to the plate, and then it feels so much easier.
I didn't know that they did that, and I go to baseball games with my husband because he loves baseball. I did not know that. I always wonder what they were doing around, swinging it around. Yeah, that's so interesting.
Well, you often see them, especially they've got like a metal donut that they put on the bat, and then they take it off before. Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay. Could you explain why low-stakes negotiation practice is a really good idea to improve skills? I talk a lot about practicing the things that we learn because that's the only way to make them work. Yeah. And we really want pills or quick fixes instead, and it's just not. That's not the way life is.
Yeah. That's basically my biggest fear about teaching negotiation. Well, for a long time was I thought there's wonderful negotiation advice out there. Getting to yes, never split the difference, difficult conversations. And a whole bunch of others. The problem isn't that we lack wonderful negotiation advice, but we notice people are still terrible despite having that good advice. And that was, kind of tormenting me, because I gave up my career as a lawyer to go back to teach negotiation with Roger when he asked me to, because he had this whole mission. He was in the 8th Air Force in the Second World War, and which was a absolutely horrific experience because so many of his friends died. He was one of 4 guys in a freshman quad, and they all went off to the war, and he's the only one that came back. And not only did so many of them get hurt or not come back at all, but they did things. I'm not trying to be anti-American. We didn't start that war. We didn't do the most terrible things in that war. But we did things. We absolutely destroyed full cities full of people. And he had so much guilt coming back afterwards that he devoted the rest of his life to trying to improve negotiation so that that wouldn't happen again. And then I kind of joined his crusade because my father's parents died when he was very young, but he had a 9-year older brother who took care of him and looked after him. And his brother, my Uncle Sid, also was in the 8th Air Force and didn't come back. And so, Roger was on this crusade to bring negotiation to the world. And, I was preferred doing that to making a lot of money as a, financial litigator in New York. But my fear always was we're not actually getting that done because people are still terrible. And then when I went with Chris and the Black Swan Group, his guys, to go teach negotiation, they got very radical behavioral change out of their students. Whereas, we would explain negotiation strategy, I think, very well to our students at Harvard and MIT, and a lot of them didn't change. But that's because negotiation is a performance skill. It's not something It's more like learning to drive a car or play a musical instrument or play a sport. And I think you have to teach it in that way, and that means a lot of low-stakes drills. If you're, coaching Little League like I used to, we take the kids to the batting cage. It's not a game. You don't have to worry about it. You just take 1 million low-stakes attempts to do it. We hit ground balls, we hit fly balls to them, and just do those easy skills one at a time until they're completely routine. And then, you'll end up much better. But just think about it. If I imagine, which is not the case, that I was a wonderful guitar player and gave people a lecture on how to play the guitar, and it was the best advice ever. They're not any better than they were before until they pick one up and make a fool of themselves and, play it badly and slightly better every time. And that's what you need to do to improve your negotiation skills. I mean, the nice thing about it is you don't have to pay money to go to the driving range or the batting cage. You can practice on the people around you being curious, asking more questions, saying no when it doesn't really matter, finding out, more about what they think is fair and right. And then you practice all those skills, and we suggest have one at a time that you're practicing, and probably take the worst part of your repertoire. We've got 9 chapters full of different things that you can be practicing. Whichever one you're worst at, start there. And as you get better, then shift to something else will be what you're worst at and move over to that. And pretty soon you'll be on your way. And at least our hope is that once you start doing this, like learn people's names and you start having more friendly interactions, that's so rewarding that, this once we get you hooked, you're going to keep doing it.
I love the mission aspect of it. I don't make any money doing the podcast, but I really believe people need more information about relationships. And I've had people hucking me about, why don't you? I've been doing it. It'll be 11 years in a couple weeks. And I'm like, I think there's something about trying to make the world a better place that we just don't pay enough attention to. And maybe I'm role modeling that for people because Lord knows there's enough information out there about monetizing your podcast, but that's not what it's about for me.
Well, I'm delighted to be helping you with that mission. That's
I didn't know if you knew about that part. I'm always talking about how important long-term thinking is. In fact, it's one of the things I really appreciate about my husband. He's one of the few people I've met who's really good at long-term thinking versus short-term, which is, now. And I think social media has made it worse. And how hard it is in our culture today. Would you share your perspective on the difference between winning and building partnerships? Because I think that's especially important with those we love, which is long-term thinking.
I mentioned Roger in the 8th Air Force. When he got back from the war, he went to law school. And then for a while, he was working at the Solicitor General's office, which is the president's lawyer for cases in the Supreme Court. And so he was assistant solicitor general. And one day he goes into the Solicitor General's office and says, "Boss, I am on a roll. I've won my first 13 cases in a row at the Supreme Court. And you want to win them all? Give them all to me and I'll win them all." And his boss says, all right, shut the door. And, opens his bottom drawer and pulls out a bottle of bourbon and a couple glasses and gives him a drink and says, "We don't want to win them all." And Roger was flabbergasted. He's like, "What do you mean? I'm busting my butt trying to win these things. You don't want me to win them?" He goes, No. That's good. We want to try to win each one, but we don't want to win them all. Because what happens if we win them all? Then if you've got a grievance against the government and the government never loses, the only thing you can do is go in your basement and start making bombs. Right? We want the people to be able to defeat the government at least some of the time. And it's the same in and this SG, this was in the aftermath of World War II. He said, who never lost in the German Supreme Court? Hitler. How'd that turn out? Like, that's not what we want. And he said it's the same as a marriage. If one spouse wins every fight, you're getting divorced. And so, letting...
That's right.
But then the question is, well, okay, so how often and when should I let them win? And there I think it's really important. Let them win when they've got a really good point. When they're right and they, ask them their questions about what they think is fair and right. And if you feel, that's a pretty good point they have. They feel, if you think that's a pretty good point they have, they think it's a rock solid, crushing point. And the more you say, all right, you're right this time, we'll do it your way. That's an investment in the kind of relationship where they're going to say to you, okay, when you're right, you're right. And I'd say that successful negotiation involves acknowledging when they're right, caring about what their interests are, and making it collaborative. It's not just that you want to, every negotiation instructor will tell you, you need to figure out what their interests are, because knowing what's motivating them is how you get them to say yes. I think it's as important to explain what's motivating you. And some people say, no, 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 knowledge is power. So you should hoard all the power and, find out what they want, but don't tell them what you want. I don't think that's a smart long-term investment. I think eventually they're going to stop telling you. But the other thing is, when you tell them what you care about and how to make you happy and how to get you to say yes to what they want, the power you're giving them is the power to make you happy. And that's a power you want them to have, but it also gives them a different role in the relationship. So an example of this, this when I was still in law school. I'd been a teaching assistant for negotiation, and the professor I was working for got invited to teach a class for a week at the University of Madrid. And so he brought a couple of his teaching assistants over to do it. And I was traveling over there with another teaching assistant. And so we flew from Boston to New York, and then we're flying to Madrid. And I had a backpack, but she had a rollerboard. And they took it from her and said, okay, we're too full, but you'll get this back on the jetway. And then when we got to New York, the bag wasn't there. And we said, well, where'd the bag go? It's still in Boston, but we'll get it to you 12 hours after you arrive in Madrid. And my colleague said to me, I'm going to go get us, upgraded to business class. And I said, no, you're not. Good luck with that. And she said, yeah, give me your ticket. And 10 minutes later, she comes back with upgrades to business class. And I said, oh my God, how'd you do that? And she says, well, I used to be a teller at Wells Fargo. And some people would come in and ask for my help and, pound the table and demand that I help them. And, then I would call for a manager or say, sorry, it's company policy. It's nothing I could do. But other people would explain their problem and ask me if I had any ideas. And those are the people that I wanted to help. And that's what I did. I went up to the clerk, at the airline counter, and I said, hey, this is a night flight. And so I thought what we were going to do is sleep in once we got there. But now, I've got work meetings in the afternoon. I'm going to have to go out in the morning and buy work clothes, so I don't look like a clown showing up at these meetings. But that means I'm not going to get any sleep. Gosh, I wish there was some, is there anything you can think of? And of course, the clerk goes, oh, well, in business class, the seats lie down flat. They become a bed, and then you can sleep on the plane. And she says, oh, my gosh, that's a great idea. That's wonderful. If you tell them how to make you happy, you allow them to be the hero of the interaction rather than casting them in the role of the, person who backs down. And I think that's long-term much more effective. And so I'd say, make yourself vulnerable by talking about, what's motivating you and what you care about and letting them have that power to make you happy.
Any other important concepts that we haven't covered or a small pearl of wisdom you'd like to share with my audience before we remind them of the title of your book and anything else you want them to know?
Sure. Well, I just wanted to follow up on that last point. I was so impressed with my colleague that I had to get married to her. And, 3 kids and 33 years later. But yeah, another thing I'd say is very often people are scared to be vulnerable and tell you what they care about. You can ask them, and some people will tell you, but other people don't trust you enough to tell you. And what I like to do there is to guess out loud and say, well, I think what's motivating you in this fight about where we send our kids to school is that, you feel there were some opportunities you didn't have growing up, and you want to make sure that your kids have the opportunities that you didn't. Whereas that was an actual disagreement I had with my wife about whether to send our kids to private school or not. And, it's what we usually do in talking about each other's interests is to say something like, oh, yeah, you want to have your kid be a snooty private school person because you want to show that you're better than everybody. That's not how they think about it, right? You want to try to describe what they think about in sympathetic terms. And then they're much more likely to say, yes, that's exactly right. And that's what you're really hoping to get when you talk about what they want, is for them to say, yeah, that's it. Which they're never going to say if you spin it like you're the opposing counsel at trial, or, the way Democrats and Republicans talk about each other is you want evil things because you're evil. And whereas, okay, I get that this is an important issue to you, and I think that's a good motive, and let's talk about different ways we could, get to that goal. Because the one you're suggesting now, I see some problems with that too. But the other thing is, if you're wrong, if you try to guess what the other person is motivated by and you're incorrect, they will almost always correct you. And, because especially if they don't like you and don't trust you, it's like, ha, you dummy, it's not that, it's this. And, okay, I stand corrected. But now you know what's motivating them, and you're in a much better position, not only to influence them, but you almost always like them better when you understand what's motivating you. Somebody who wants something for no good reason, that's an annoying person. But once you understand, okay, I get why they care about this, it's hard not to be sympathetic.
And your book and anything else you want them to know.
Okay, I'm going to hold it up. Never settle. Persuasion and negotiation skills to get what you want. It's, goes over the consensus advice in negotiation, but it's not groundbreaking in that sense. But for all of those, it makes them super specific in terms of behavior to try out, and suggests ways to practice, by manipulating your friends and family and loved ones. That will, over time, build up to a great set of negotiation skills.
And wonderful exercises, really. I really appreciated the book a lot. I think it's got a lot to offer. Persuasion without pressure, negotiation without resentments, aim for clarity, compassion, and creativity and curiosity in every conversation. Thanks for listening. Keep building the bridges. My website, therapyideas.net, has over 450 pages of free information without ads, just like the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for listening to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave a rating and review on iTunes and help get the word out. To learn more or connect with Rhoda, visit therapyideas.net.